Hello, this video will serve as an introduction to chapter 1 in week 3. So yes, we are starting to write our dissertations this week. Yay. As a reminder, chapter 1 is where you're going to introduce your reader to your study or kind of setting the stage and the context for your topic and your problem of practice and explaining why it matters, especially to you, but also what is the significance to others, right? And the field. The sections that we're going to be working on in the template specifically this week are the overview, the organizational profile, and the introduction to the problem. And we'll talk about those in a minute. You are going to be reading the 3 textbooks this week. Make sure you do that before you attempt to do the learning activities and write these parts of your dissertation, because each of these textbooks gives you a unique lens through which to view what you're writing about and that section. They might call them different things. That's okay. Dissertations vary immensely from program to program and institution to institution. So make sure you do those readings first. You will notice, though, that the dissertation guidelines and the dissertation kind of say template looks familiar to that in the appendix for the step-by-step guide to conducting applied research and education textbook. That's intentional, right? You're writing an applied research dissertation. So we were intentional in making sure that the template you use is for applied research. And then we grounded that in what we do here at SVU and the specifics of our different types of dissertations, etc. One thing to note this week is that the lessons are reminders from the course that you took on, the Franciscan values and the Franciscan mission with Father David. And those lessons are from him, from his course. You've already seen them, but it's to remind you again and ground you in those Franciscan values, because throughout your dissertation, that is one of the lenses that you're going to use to be doing this work. And you'll want to come back to, how you made certain decisions within those Franciscan values. Okay. And I'll try to point out some areas that you can do that. Not that you have to do that in those areas, but if you need examples of how and when that might be good to do. And I did give you a reminder reading. Again, this is from a previous course on the Franciscan values if you need a refresher. So for this week, again, you are going to be drafting the first 3 sections of chapter 1. That is the overview, the organizational profile, and the introduction to the problem and your problem of practice. You can read more about what each of these sections are again in the textbook, as well as in the different lessons that are integrated throughout this chapter. I am going to go ahead and pull up the actual template, and so that you can see the different sections we're going to be working on. I'm going to go through these very briefly. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. The overview, it's pretty short, sweet, and to the point, right? What is the purpose? You can open up with the purpose of this dissertation is to, and whatever it is that you're wanting to accomplish as a result of this. You're going to say very clearly what the problem is following that purpose statement. So the purpose of this dissertation is to XYZ. And you can expand on that in a couple sentences. Maybe you provide some context to your topic and you can elaborate on that, making sure you include citations for anything that's not common knowledge, right? And then briefly discuss your problem statement, because you'll have a whole section where you can get into your problem. And then you're going to kind of talk about, and this will be true for every section, you're going to outline what the major heading sections are in the chapter. Okay. So the overview is pretty short. You can look at some of in each of the methods weeks. So when we start talking about quant research, there's an example of quantitative dissertation. There's an example of a qualitative dissertation and a mixed methods dissertation that you can look at. So those are not just, we don't have any dissertations yet because you're the first group for SBU. We don't have any dissertations that have gone through all the way yet because the first groups, there's no exemplars, but we will be adding those eventually. So I use, with permission of the students in my previous institution, I have asked them if they would allow me to use theirs as an example until we have some. Keeping in mind that the template at my previous institution, well, there were 3 different templates. There was a qual template, quant, and mixed. Maybe we'll get to that point here too. But those templates and the different sections are going to look slightly different than in this course at this institution in this program. But you'll get the general idea of what the overview should look like, right? So if you need to see some examples, feel free to take a look at those weeks with those examples in them. So you have a brief overview. It's an overview to your topic. It's also an overview to the chapter. Then we have an organizational profile. Okay. First thing, very, very important to know is for your dissertation, for your research that you're going to be conducting, in order to get your IRB through, everything must be de-identified. And what do I mean by that? You are not naming, for example, in this section, the name of the educational site. You are not naming the organization. You're not naming any people, faculty or staff, right? Or heaven forbid, students, right? One of the jobs we have as scholarly practitioners and researchers is to protect our participants. And one way that we protect our participants is making sure that they're not identifiable, that we give them pseudonyms, whatever is applicable to your situation. We don't ever name, the organizations or the people involved in our research. Okay. Now, for quant researchers, this is obviously not as, you don't have to worry about this as much because a lot of times it's de-identified data from the beginning and, it's a survey research or something like that or existing data, not a problem. Qual researchers, sometimes you do have to say, you have to give them names or participant number, whatever the case may be, and identify them yourself as part of the research. That's okay too. But please keep in mind when you're writing this organizational profile in this course, but also when you're writing your IRB, none of this should be identifiable, okay? If you choose to use pseudonyms, just like this shows up here, put it in parentheses that it's a pseudonym, and you just have to do that the first time you use it. So say you decide to name your school district a different school district or your nonprofit a different name than what it actually is, right? Go ahead the first time you do that and put that is a pseudonym after in parentheses, okay? So then you're going to describe the different kind of aspects that are relevant to that organizational profile to your work. One thing to note, though, in this organizational profile section is that you need to be looking at this through the lens of, your local sphere of influence as well as complexity theory, okay? And that we're talking about, you're taking an entire course right now in conjunction with this course that Dr. Margolis is teaching around some of these complexity theories, etc. Your dissertation is a living document. Keep that in mind throughout this entire process. Like, it is going to be a living document until you submit it after your final defense and you're done, right? With those modifications in your defense. So it's going to be a long time before this is a final. You are going to be updating all of these sections throughout this process. It is living, and therefore, for example, you might write an organizational profile draft for this course, right? And then you're taking Dr. Margolis's class and you learn something about like complexity theory and looking at systems theories and looking at it through that lens. And you might want to come back to this section. Actually, I would encourage you to come back to this section and make modifications to it based on what you're learning in that course. And when you submit your final first 3 draft chapters to me in this course, one thing I'm going to be looking for is how have you modified this dissertation based on my feedback to you, as well as what you've learned in other courses or are still learning about. You can do that. I would highly encourage you, anytime you make a change to anything in your dissertation, put it in yellow highlight, or whatever kind of system works for you, and you indicate what that system is. But as you're making changes, yellow highlight, okay? But look at your organizational profile from, this lens of complexity theory, because all of our systems in which we operate are complex. Okay, explain that to us. So it's important for us to know that in respect to your research, right? And then you're going to introduce us to your problem of practice. Okay. This is everything from, simply restating your problem of practice that you stated in the overview to then tell us more. And that could be statistics, it could be facts, it could be narrative, whatever that looks like for your problem of practice. Tell us what it is. Very, very thoroughly describe your problem of practice. And by the way, you can use work you've used in other courses. Say you have this fabulous description of your problem in practice. You use it in another course in this program. You're more than welcome to bring it in here. Okay. I would encourage you to, as much as possible, start integrating that. Now, having said that, it's not necessarily going to be a copy and paste, right? Because you're going to be wanting this to flow properly, right? And you don't want these random paragraphs from random courses like coming together and it's totally disconnected, right? Make it flow and make sure you're rewording it so it's appropriate to an introduction to the problem of practice in a dissertation. That might be making it more thorough than what you wrote before. You might be addressing things like what was done in the past to solve this problem. Maybe in that other course, you didn't have to address that. Maybe what is currently being done to solve that problem in practice now. Maybe you didn't have to address that in a previous course, so you are integrating that in here. And then again, being like explicit and meaningful in respect to those Franciscan values. One thing to keep in mind in the introduction, as well as, even chapter 2 in the lit review, is this should be very narrative. You should not have, especially in chapter 1, even in chapter 2, you're not going to have bullets. You're not going to have long quotes, block quotes. You wouldn't necessarily have lists or figures or tables or anything like that. This is going to be much more narrative. Now, when you get into chapter 3 and chapter 4, that's a different story, right? But for these first 2 chapters, this is much more narrative, paragraph form, APA, the whole 9 yards. Again, you can kind of see where the rubric criteria fits in. If you have any questions, feel free to, reach out and let me know. Again, for this assignment, you're going to write in that template. Save the template, your first name, last name, and then whatever the template already says in terms of file name. But I need each of you to make sure you include first name, last name, because I'm going to be opening a lot of these things and I don't want anything to get confused, okay? Each week, you're going to be adding to this. If you don't want to, you don't have to change the title unless, I know I had some students who always updated the title that included the date at the end, so they knew which one was their most recent draft. If you want a system like that, that's totally cool. All I need from you each week is that you're adding to the same one. So for example, this week you're going to do the overview, organizational profile, and introduction to the problem. Next week, you're going to be adding the significance, the purpose statement, and the research questions to what you're doing this week in that same template. Okay. If you run into anything or you have questions or need help, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, good luck and I hope it goes well.